Have you ever heard of the Bhagavad Gita? What about the Mahabharata? You ever heard of Lao Tzu? What do you think about the Tao Te Ching? You ever heard of the Upanishads before? So I know you've heard about the Essene Gospel, right? What about the Gospel of Thomas? Philip? Now I know you heard of the Gospel of Mary. I know you have. What about the Gospel of Barabbas? What do you think about that? You ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh before? What about the Epic of Enuma Elish? What do you think about the Egyptian Book of the Dead? What did you think about the last part of the Dead Sea Scrolls? How much time have you spent studying religious science? You ever heard of, what about science of mind? You heard of that before? New Thought? Christianity? Have you ever heard of John Darby before? And do you know what happened in 1830 that really reshaped, or I guess you could say not reshaped, it actually shaped the whole doctrine and the idea of, let's just say, let's talk about eschatology, the shaping of eschatology. You ever heard of E.W. Schofield before in relationship to John Darby in 1830? What about the Gospel of Mary or Philip or Thomas? Now I know you heard of the Gnostic Gospel. I know 1,000% that you heard of the Gnostic Gospel. What do you think about the eternal way? Does it really strike you as something that is really mystical, especially with it being a part of the larger work or an interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, which of course stems back as one of the oldest known paths to date. So I could go on and on. Chances are, if you're like me, and if you grew up, especially if you grew up in my demographic of the African American demographic, chances are, at least out of the 30 some odd things I just mentioned, and those of you all that just joined, thanks so much for hanging out. And when you get a chance, so that this has some better context, go ahead and when we finish the video, when you get a chance, take it back from the top and just listen to the list that I said. So, chances are, if you are like me, at least 25 to 27 out of the at least 30 things I mentioned, you may have never heard before. And that's okay. Neither did I. Thank you everybody for watching this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'd say at least about 40 minutes for part two of my journey from Christianity to secular humanism and atheism, which are all pretty dirty words in many ways. You're going to have to excuse my GPS because yesterday I had headphones on. And today I don't have those with me, so my apologies. I'll be stopping here and there just to listen to that. But chances are, if you grew up like me, you haven't heard of at least 27. What about Unitarian Universalism? You ever heard of Eric Holmes before? What about the metaphysical Bible? What about metaphysics in general? Fillmore? You familiar with any Fillmore? Charles Fillmore? So I bring these things up because one thing that I've learned over the past 10 years of this journey is that the number one thing that's the cause of most of us not knowing or not hearing of or being familiar with at least 27 out of the 35 things now that I mentioned. Maybe I should raise the number, maybe 30 out of 35, is due to lack of education. And I don't mean that directly as an insult. What I mean is our institutions, our organizations, many of our religious and spiritual organizations do not encourage education. They do not encourage education. And what I mean, in order to be specific, is they don't encourage education about other religious paths and to be able to explore and understand and know. Excuse me, my allergies are flaring up on me. I got my water though, but you may get tired of me clearing my throat. But they don't encourage education when it comes to other religious and spiritual paths. And usually this is because the idea is to keep us focused on what is the quote-unquote right one, the quote-unquote true one, the quote-unquote only one. Excuse me, y'all, big cough. You know how you just got that? Just gotta cough it. I think this is one of the biggest downfalls of humanity when it comes to coexisting and understanding the world around us and being able to operate in a world where many people believe different things for very different, strong, and understandable reasons. If you just take a second to do some research and to just find out why other people believe what they believe. What's up, everybody? Thanks for hanging out. If we just take a second. Here's a few more. Let's go ahead and add on to that list. Let's go from 35 to 40. Now, this may be more in the realm of some things that you may have heard. Maybe not the first 5, but maybe after that. You ever heard of Tiamat before? What about Enkidu? I mentioned Gilgamesh earlier. You ever heard of the Sumerian floods? Any other Sumerian stories? Now, if you have at least taken the time to learn a little bit more about Jewish culture, then you may have heard of the Tanakh. You may have heard of the Torah. Did you know that Orthodox Jews don't believe in Satan? Do you know what Satanism is all about, actually? Or is your understanding that it's about some people who their entire idea is to do as much negative and wrong as possible? If it is, I can't blame you for that. If it is, I can't blame you for that. Because 10 years ago for me, it was as well. Now I may be coming more into the territory of some things that many of you have heard of and maybe even know some things about. Familiar with agnosticism? You're familiar with the definition of atheism? and not the stereotype. And the difference between that and being anti-theist. Are you familiar with secular humanism and the tenets? So, one last thing I wanted to say. I forgot to mention it when I was mentioning the Jewish concepts with the Torah and the Tanakh and some of these other things. I did mention it. So, did you know that Orthodox Jews don't believe in Satan? No, they don't believe in the devil. The next question is, do you know why? And it probably should spark a question, especially if your faith is Christianity and you at least know that the two, along with Islam, all come from the same mothering philosophy. These three are what we call the Abrahamic faith. Now, I didn't know that either. Even what I just said about Orthodox Jews not believing in the devil. But the thing is, if both sects, even if you just use Christianity and Judaism, if they're both coming from the same book, and eventually they go off in different directions later on, how is it that one faith believes in a negative entity called Satan and the other doesn't, from the perspective of it being a negative entity? So all these are questions that I had. Well, actually, that wasn't a question I had. That was something I learned, and then a question that I had after that was, why don't we know this? Why is this not encouraged? And I think that the biggest downfall of our culture and our religious organizations is that while having organized study, and I'll really say more so propagation, and just so that you don't take that in a negative way, what I mean is I propagate music theory. You know, it's something that I not only have an understanding of to a degree, but it's also something that I think, I believe strongly in, as far as, well, I guess that's a bad example because it has to do with something that you feel strongly about. And the propagating means you're just taking the ideas as already believed and just continuing to push those forward to, in order to help others to believe and understand the same. The problem, though, like I was mentioning yesterday, is that way is filled with all kind of confirmation bias. And speaking of which, the other thing I wanted to ask, and again, for anybody that's like, what is this all about? Two things. I mentioned it yesterday and I'll mention it today. First thing is, even in the midst of my demographic of the African American culture and where I was born, there are many, many, many people who are silent on a regular basis because the tradition and the faith that they grew up with, no, it doesn't work for them. Maybe it never did. Maybe it did, like in my case, for 27 out of 36 years. Or maybe it did for longer. And now, though, there may be some questions. And the first reason why I'm doing this is to help someone. It's not to convert. It's none of that. It's actually to help, because in the midst of, if I just use statistics just to make it practical, excuse me, if I use statistics, in the midst of every 10 people, there's 1 or 2 or 3 people that quietly don't really identify with the philosophy and don't have anybody to talk to, don't know what to do about it, don't know, they're in their private time doing their own research, and they may even be excited about what they're finding, but they may be in a situation where it could cost them their relationships, it could cost them their family members, it could cost them their job, it could cost them the social benefits that they get, or the acceptance, or even the love. And so it really is something special when you find out that someone who you either are close to, admire, are aware of, feel comfortable with, or look up to can at least relate on a very bottom line basic level, or all the way to the highest level of everything you're saying. Wow, I've been saying this for years, whatever. So that's the first reason why I'm doing it. The second reason why I'm doing it is where the way that I started off this live stream, which is for educational purposes. For educational purposes. My desire is to be able to do the same thing that I did for myself, which was to help other people be aware of some things that they would be open to if they knew it existed, or if they took the time to look into it. It helps our world. It helps coexisting. It helps us to understand each other better. Carlton Pearson has a saying, you don't have to go along to get along. And there's another saying I've heard, we don't have to have the same mind. We don't have to have the same mind about things in order to mind the same things. So this is for that purpose. Let me throw in about 10 more things. 10 more have you heard of things. Have you ever heard of a red herring and not an actual fish? Have you ever heard of the no true Scotsman fallacy? Have you ever heard of argument from ignorance or argument from credulity? And I may be pronouncing that right. It may be incredulity. Have you ever heard of argument from popularity? Have you ever heard of confirmation bias and logical fallacies just in general? So all these things are things that I've studied over the past 10 years. And I'm so grateful that I did, because the first thing was it opened me up to education, which was not something that was motivated by the organizations that I have been a part of, not motivated by just the places that I've been in general. Again, excuse me for clearing my voice. Allergies flaring up. So I want to give some information and then talk about a few things, and then I'll wrap it up for today. The first thing is this. I would highly encourage, highly encourage everybody. This is purely for education, no matter where you stand on things. If you are of the Christian faith, I would highly suggest that you go to Open Yale courses. Open Yale, as in the school, YALE courses. And I would highly advise you to take the absolutely 1,000,000% free Old Testament and New Testament video courses, where you can just watch the lectures, and you basically can get at least a $10,000 to $20,000 education for absolutely free. And it's extremely thorough. And it will help you even more so to understand. Again, this is no matter what side you stand on. I don't care whether a person believes or doesn't believe. I care about education. The worst type of not knowing and ignorance is the kind that comes when you don't know what you don't know. Speaking of which, let me throw a few more in there. Have you ever heard of the Council of Nicaea, Constantine in 325 AD? What about the Council of Hippo, 367 AD? Have you ever heard of Athanasius? Do you know what his letter was to the church during the Easter time, which shaped the modern book that we know, and gave specific directions of which books to include and which not to include, and for specific reasons? Did you know that there was a book of Peter chapter 3, a third Peter. And I'll say this. Did you know that in that chapter, the idea of the cross and the tomb concept had I swear you might, there are many people that's going to think I'm really, really kidding around when I say this, or I'm pulling your leg, but I promise you I'm not. Just do the research. Where there was a walking and talking crucifix or cross, a walking and talking piece of wood, and they felt that it was too ridiculous and that people would never, engage in it or believe in it. So it was ordered to be removed, but it was actually a part of the original. OpenYaleCourses.com. You'll find a very thorough, in-depth biblical historical criticism, a historical trekking through of the Bible, and I think you'll really appreciate it. Again, no matter where you stand, you will really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. So from the year 2010, I would say up until probably 2016, I was studying theology and studying, religion and spirituality for 7 to 8 hours a day. Like I told you all, I gotten to a point as a musician within the church that I was completely confident and comfortable with how to flow in a service and how to play the music and that kind of thing, how to literally just the whole nine, and things were going well. But I got the opportunity at that point. I started paying more attention to doctrine and theology, and I started wanting to really know why I believe what I believe. It first started with holidays. It started with I know we all do this around Christmas, but if I really look at this, the whole idea of winter, and have you ever heard of Saturnalia? So I'm trying to figure out why Easter, why Christmas, what the origins are. And I learned about Saturnalia. I learned about Ishtar and Easter as the spring fertility goddess. And then here's the other thing that's really important. Then I also learned that a lot of the things that was demonized by my culture, by my churches, and all that kind of thing was purely from the perspective, mostly from the perspective of just ignorance, just not knowing, being afraid of anything that was different than what we already professed or already subscribed to, and then just purely not knowing. I have a quote that I kind of came up with about 6 years ago, and that was that so many of us are running for our lives when it comes to what we're taught religiously or spiritually. So many of us are so busy running for our lives that we never get the opportunity to just stop and even examine what we're running for to begin with, to just even examine the foundation of the ideas, and these are a part of the absolute core. And so as I started doing that research on the holidays and started doing more research on why we went through with the rituals and where they came from, I basically started running into the education that helped me to understand who we were, who we are, who we were at that time, what our level of understanding was at that time about the world around us, and what we were trying to accomplish. What we were trying to accomplish and the questions we were trying to answer. And it literally changed everything. It literally changed everything. So one of the biggest things and I'm going to be doing a bunch of educational videos about this. There's going to be two channels because there's another community that myself and my buddy Andre Forbes, good friend of mine, is going to start. And again, it's a hub and safe haven for those that either risk disassociation and excommunication at the strongest end of the spectrum, or at the mildest end of the spectrum, just being seen in a way that they don't want to be seen. It'll be a safe haven for people to be able to talk and have conversations with like-minded individuals. It'll also be connected from a niche-based perspective. It'll be connected to our experience as growing up in the African American setting of church, and also in relationship to the music, and those that participate in the music, and from any perspective, whether they're a musician, whether they're a minister of music, whether they are a choir member or singer or artist or what have you, and have experienced some of these things. And then it'll branch out from there and pretty much just be open for anyone who just needs a community or others that can relate in that way. And so I was fortunate because during the time for me that I was studying, I had a few close friends that I could talk to. I did lose some relationships, unfortunately, and I understand it, even though I think again that it's actually a part of the issue, because I know the ideas that these people were standing on as they decided to just completely disassociate. But at any rate, that's why I go forward and trying to spread education and spread love. So if anybody asks, what's the whole purpose of this? The whole purpose is just that. I'll be doing an entire series of videos that's dedicated to education. Okay, so let's start here. Let's talk about the definition of secular humanism. Let's talk about the definition of atheism. So secular humanism is, and I don't have my, of course I'm driving, so I don't have you guys can Google it, do a Wikipedia, do a Google search, so that way you can see a direct definition. Now remember, dictionaries define word usages more so than what things actually mean. It defines how we colloquially use the terms. So secular humanism is someone who is totally engaged with the wealth of human beings and humanity in general, and someone who believes that we're able to address those things with or without a God. And it doesn't directly tell you if the person believes in a God or not, but it tells you that they feel it's a completely separate issue as far as our well-being and our humanity and what we do. The term atheist is a person who's currently not convinced that there is, a deity or gods in existence or whatever. Now, I want to talk about that, and I'm actually probably going to stay there for these last 20 minutes because this is probably one of the biggest topics and points of discussion in education. So many people, let me go through the stereotypes and the complete misunderstandings and miseducation on the term. Many people think that the term atheist means devil worshiper, or somebody, if they obviously don't subscribe to the idea that there's a God, that they must then worship or work for a negative entity. So one thing I'm proud to do right now in this moment for anybody who was under that impression or something close is that a person who is an atheist or non-theist does not believe in a negative entity or devil or Satan. It goes along with the understanding and the position of not being convinced of deity or a god or gods. That's both the ones that people openly worship and the ones that people and they feel are positive and the ones that people feel are negative. So that's the first thing I want to help somebody with. The second thing I want to help with is the difference between, now these two statements may sound exactly the same, but there's a difference between the two, and it's literally night and day. There's a difference between a person saying that no God exists and a person saying that they don't believe in a God. The first position, have you all ever heard of the burden of proof? The burden of proof. Drop a line too, please, everybody. Engage with me, if you will. That statement, no gods exist, adopt what we call a burden of proof. A burden of proof means that you're making a claim, and then now that claim has to be backed up and justified with evidence. If it's not, then you're basically making what we call a bald assertion. And I like to call it a bald head assertion. No offense to anybody who's bald. It's like you don't have anything there. There's no hair there. It's just something that is an assertion. The second statement, a person who doesn't believe or a person who's not convinced, is just that. It is that to date, a person is not convinced, which means that they can be convinced with the right evidence. They can be convinced, and this is what we call healthy skepticism. Here's the thing, and I can't wait to continue to elaborate on this. We use this form of thinking every single day. I'm using it right now as I drive. You're using it if you're driving right now. You're using it right now if you are just in your house operating a certain way or walking down the street a certain way. What I mean by that is there are certain things to date that we are convinced of. I'll use the road, for example. Everybody, we're all in this particular construct right now on this highway.
Take exit 31.
And what I mean by that is everybody's driving in the same direction. And all of these white lines that are right here in between us are literally not actual barriers. They're just agreed upon to date understandings of the best way to drive with the least amount of accidents, the most harmony, and the most efficiency toward the goal. The goal in this case is travel and everybody getting to their destinations in a faster way than walking. Now, the truth of the matter is somebody could come along and say, hey, instead of lines here, we should take the lines away, and on this same side of the highway, we should have someone coming down in the middle of the highway or a lane that's coming towards us. Now, we would all know that'd be completely tragic. But my point is this. Why wouldn't we accept that? The reason why we wouldn't accept it is because to date, this particular system shows the evidence is that this gives us the best way to travel. It's not that we're against the other way. And I should use a better example, like one where you could actually see a transition in thought. I'll figure out what I can come up with. One where we have been convinced, like things have changed and we have evolved from there. Somebody throw one out too, because I'm driving, so I'm trying to think, do a couple things at one time.
Turn left onto Maryland 97 South.
So my point is that we're not closed off. You take the diet that you're on. You're not closed off to the idea of other diets.
Turn left onto Maryland 97 South, Georgia Avenue.
You weren't closed-minded to the idea of other diets before you got on the diet that you're on now. You weren't closed off to it. It's just that to date, you weren't convinced that was a better diet. As soon as it was shown to you that this was a better diet, then more than likely you gave it some thought, you assessed it, you compared the two, and then based off of, wow, people do crazy things when they drive. Then based off of the evidence that you had and how the two measured up to each other, You use healthy skepticism to say, you know what, I did go with this before, now I'll go with this because this actually shows side-by-side comparison and this is better. So there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism. Cynicism is what most people mistake healthy skepticism for. Cynicism is someone who, I was explaining this to my daughter earlier. Cynicism is when someone is closed off to just anything. Now, I actually would argue that most of us from a religious path are actually taught cynicism more than anything, which is that there can be no other way of looking at life or no other truth other than the one that we uphold, and the goal is to deflect everything else. That's actually cynicism. Skepticism is being able to say, this to date works, but I'm willing to examine everything else, and I'm willing to look at what I currently accept, put it on the table, not be biased about it, and put it in the same playing field as everything else, and then be honest if it actually measures up, or if something else is better, or has a better idea, or if there's something mistaken. But we don't even have a process like that for our religious paths to even do that. And that, unfortunately, is no matter how good something is and brings about certain things that are positive, the issue is that when there's something negative there, you have absolutely no way of identifying it because of bias, a predisposition to bias, and it's not intentional. So I say that to say that the proper definition of atheism is a person who's not currently convinced. Now, where do I fall in that particular place? So I was a person who, for 27 years of my life, was convinced by certain things. And then, now where I stand, the things that I was convinced of, I'm no longer convinced by. And again, it's only because of education. There are a lot of things that I found out that I believed for not so good reasons. And what I mean by that is, because I got to put it into context, they were good reasons from the perspective of they made me feel good, they made me feel comfortable, they gave me even a productive life. It was also a part of my culture, a part of my family, a part of my heritage, and it also provided for fellowship and for community in a specific way. That was all good. The bad reasons was when I was actually flawed in my thinking and I wasn't actually applying proper logic and reason to it. It really just actually didn't make sense. But I was just accepting it for the social benefits and because at that point I wasn't exposed to anything else. Those are not so good reasons. Now, here's the thing about that. I mean, it's like driving on this road, and it's like the difference between me believing and following this structure of driving in between these lines and going in the same direction as everyone else and waiting and turning and stopping on red because of the fact that I can clearly see accidents that happen and I'm looking at the system. It's the difference between believing it for that reason, which is a good reason and leading to that benefit, and doing that same thing because I think that there's someone else telling me to just follow those rules. The problem is that if all of a sudden I feel like a person is or entity is telling me to do something different, if I'm not judging it by what I'm actually seeing and what I'm doing, then I could possibly do something that's objectionably tragic. And if I was following this system because of that same reason, I would be getting to the benefit, but maybe not for the best reasons. So the things that I was convinced of for 27 years are things that I'm no longer convinced of now. I understand them, and I even understand why I agreed with them or believed them. But now I realize that a lot of it was based in flawed logic. A lot of it was based in a predisposition to bias. A lot of it was based in not knowing anything about anything else. And a lot of it was based in not even knowing the history of my own faith, not even knowing the history of the particular path that I was on, like the deep history. And so that that's that. So, if I could, like I said, even in just this little segment, that I'll continue on, it would be that most people have a completely misinformed idea of what the term atheist or atheism means. And many people think that it's someone who's cynical, who adopts a burden of proof and says that they know for a fact that no God exists. And that's not the definition. And people who do that, we call them hard atheists. People who adopt a burden of proof. And is actually just as bad as the person that they're trying to either convince or convert or debate or what have you, because they're adopting a burden of proof as well. And then when you adopt a burden of proof, you have to actually demonstrate that, and that can't be demonstrated. The only thing that can be said by a person is that to date, if they're honest, to date we don't know, or to date we're not convinced. And then that allows you to stay open to be convinced if it's actually true. And it also allows you to be able to have an honest position. And many of our positions are actually not fully based on honesty, if we be honest with ourselves, no pun intended. A lot of it is just based on what we deal with emotionally and how things make us feel. So an atheist is not a devil worshiper, nor is it a person who, if they're a proper skeptic, who says that they know for a fact that there are no God or gods that exist. But it's a person that says, currently, with what has been brought forth, either by other people or books, even holy books, isn't convincing as far as proper evidence to be able to draw that conclusion. The conclusion that I personally come to when it comes to a lot of these things, especially with our holy books, is that these are documents that are very much written by humankind. And I have to say man, because that's actually part of the problem. It's mostly patriarchal in nature, except for when you go back and you get outside of the Abrahamic faiths. And then you get to the feminine touch on things. And then you start to see why, at this point, the idea of the feminine, when it comes to spirituality and religion, is supremely suppressed. And what I mean by that is, in our culture, how many of us refer to God as he, as opposed to she, or what have you? And that's not just by happenstance. This is very, very, very patriarchal in nature. But it's understandable to me. For me at this point, it's understandable. In fact, it helps me to frame things better, because it helps me to understand how you could have a people that write certain things that is extremely misogynistic in character. And that's, extremely misogynistic in character, but it be something that you understand why, especially if up until the 1700s, I think it was, I might get my dates wrong. I have to go back and do this, but it was, I believe, up into the 1700s. But it was at some point in time that we really didn't understand the physiological makeup of women when it came down to menstrual cycles and and that kind of thing. So at one point, men were literally afraid of women, because it was like, how can you go through this kind of thing and bleed in this way and not die? Like, you must be more powerful than we are. That sparked fear and the need to control. And then before you know it, then you not only have patriarchy leading, where the men are dominant, but the men's gods are dominant as well. And the men's gods are also men too, i.e., you keep stacking that on top of each other. And then you even have a concept like God the head of Christ, Christ the head of man, man the head of woman. And most people don't see why that's an issue or why that's a problem, actually. So these are all things that I'm going to be talking about in detail. Right now, I'm just kind of doing a big old introduction just to open things up. I've got tons and tons of stuff to talk about. Like I told you guys, I literally studied religion, spirituality, and theology for 7 to 8 hours a day. It was at one point for years where I wasn't even really studying music like that. I was studying it in practice and in performance, but the main bulk of my time was studying history and studying religion and spirituality from the ground up. So, yeah, I think for the sake of this, I think I'll stop here because I want to kind of come fresh again with the next live stream. And I also want to give everybody a chance to respond to this live stream. Please share it, even if it's shocking to you. Please, like, share it with somebody else and tell them, I can't believe this dude. That'd be fine. All engagement is welcome. All engagement is welcome. And so, on that note, I love you guys. Tune in about 30 minutes because I will be back at Twins Club in DC with my soulful brother, soul brother number one. Shout out to Clarence Ward III and his concept and the group that feel good. If you're in the DC area, come on out and hang with us. We'll be at Twins Jazz Club, and we have 2 sets, one at 9 and one at 11, and we have another very, very special person, Mr. Corey Baker, my guy. Shout out to Corey. So that's about it, everybody. Sorry, I know that was a little plug that wasn't relevant to the topic, but it's life, reality TV. Speaking of which, please subscribe to Aaron Hill TV. These conversations, these topics, as well as everything else that you guys are used to from me, will continue to be broadcast on that channel. And yeah, so we're going forward in education, we're going forward in love, we're going forward in everything that you guys know me for standing for. That'll never change. This is a different kind of conversation. I'm not trying to enter the debate market of people, of going. Now, I don't mind a healthy debate, but exchange, proper, good conversation and exchange. So on that note, peace, everybody. Stay tuned and be having some fun in a few. Please drop all comments and questions. I don't care where you stand. I don't care if you agree or disagree. If you have questions, drop something so that we can continue to have a conversation. Peace, everybody. One love.